road stretched out before me, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forest. My headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating only a small patch of the road ahead. The trees on either side loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out as if to grasp at my car. It was a moonless night, the kind of black that seemed to swallow everything it touched. I was alone, the hum of the engine my only company as I drove deeper into the night. I had left the city later than I intended, a last-minute meeting at work delaying my departure. Now I was paying for it, forced to navigate this remote stretch of highway with nothing but my wits and a full tank of gas. The nearest town was miles away, and my phone had lost signal hours ago. The isolation was oppressive, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an unseen animal. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, its eyes reflecting the light in a ghostly glow. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a person. A woman, standing on the shoulder, her figure barely distinguishable in the dim light. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in dark, matted strands around her face. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. She raised her hand, waving me down. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and concern. I rolled down the window as I came to a stop beside her. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the vast emptiness. "Please, can you help me?" she replied, her voice trembling. "My car broke down, and I don't have a phone." Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Sure, get in. I'll give you a ride to the nearest town." She opened the door and slipped into the passenger seat, her movements slow and deliberate. As she settled in, I caught a whiff of something musty, like damp earth and decaying leaves. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead as I started driving again. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I've been out here for hours. I was beginning to think no one would come." "No problem," I replied, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She was pale, her eyes wide and dark, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Where were you headed?" "Just trying to get home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The conversation lapsed into silence, the only sound the steady drone of the engine and the tires on the pavement. The further we drove, the more uneasy I became. Something about her didn't feel right. Her presence seemed to fill the car with a palpable sense of dread, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake by picking her up. "Do you live around here?" I asked, trying to dispel the tension. She shook her head slowly. "No, not anymore." Her answer sent a chill down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white in the dim light. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer to the road as if trying to swallow us whole. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing where the road forked. I stopped the car, unsure which way to go. The woman beside me stirred, her eyes locking onto mine. "Take the left path," she said, her voice suddenly firm and commanding. I hesitated, a primal fear clawing at my insides. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she insisted. "It's the only way." Reluctantly, I turned the wheel and took the left fork. The road narrowed even further, the trees crowding in until their branches scraped against the sides of the car. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, my headlights struggling to penetrate the darkness. "How much farther?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not far now," she replied, a strange smile playing on her lips. We drove in silence for another few minutes, the tension in the car growing unbearable. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the trees abruptly parted, revealing a dilapidated house at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. "Stop here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I pulled the car to a halt, my heart hammering in my chest. She opened the door and stepped out, turning to face me one last time. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice dripping with an unsettling calm. I watched as she walked towards the house, her figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. A sense of overwhelming relief washed over me as she disappeared from sight. I took a deep breath, ready to turn the car around and get as far away from this place as possible. But just as I was about to put the car in reverse, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. It was her, the woman I had just dropped off, but something was different. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her smile had twisted into a grotesque grin. Panic surged through me. I floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as I sped down the driveway and back onto the main road. I didn't look back, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that house as I could. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Eventually, I reached a small town and pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my phone to call for help. When the attendant came out to assist me, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words stuck in my throat. "Calm down," he said, his brow furrowed in concern. "What house are you talking about?" I described the house as best as I could, the fork in the road, the woman. His face went pale, and he shook his head slowly. "That house burned down years ago," he said quietly. "No one's lived there since." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just heard. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "Positive. And you're not the first person to come through here with a story like that." I left the gas station in a daze, my mind reeling. I never found out who or what that woman was, but one thing was certain. That night, I had come face to face with something beyond my understanding, something that still haunts me to this day. And every time I drive down a dark, lonely road, I can't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there, waiting for another ride. The night was darker than I'd ever seen, as if the stars themselves had abandoned the sky. I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine blending with the rhythmic thump of my tires on the cracked pavement. I was on a lonely stretch of road through the mountains, the kind that twists and turns unpredictably, surrounded by dense forest on either side. My eyes were heavy, fatigue gnawing at my concentration, but I was determined to make it to the cabin before dawn. The road was desolate, not a single car in sight, and the isolation was starting to get to me. Every rustle in the trees and shadow on the road seemed amplified in the stillness. The only light came from my headlights, casting eerie shapes that danced and flickered, playing tricks on my tired mind. I was jolted from my thoughts by a sudden bump. My car lurched, and I fought to keep it steady. I must have hit a pothole or debris. My heart raced as I slowed down, squinting through the windshield to see if I had damaged something. I pulled over to the side, my headlights catching a glimpse of something on the road ahead. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit into me, making me shiver. I walked cautiously towards the object, the beam of my flashlight revealing a large, black duffel bag lying in the middle of the road. It looked out of place, almost deliberate, as if someone had dropped it there on purpose. As I approached, I noticed something even more unsettling, a faint trail of dark liquid leading from the bag towards the trees. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to get back in the car and drive away, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I nudged the bag with my foot, and it shifted, something inside making a dull thud. With trembling hands, I unzipped the bag just enough to peer inside. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the contents, and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Inside the bag were bloodied clothes and what looked like clumps of hair. I staggered back, my mind racing with horrific possibilities. I needed to call the police, but my phone had no signal. Panic surged through me. I hurried back to my car, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the trees. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam trembling as I pointed it towards the source of the voice. The trees stood silent, their shadows deep and impenetrable. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step towards the sound. "Please help me." The voice came again, clearer this time, filled with desperation. I moved cautiously towards the edge of the forest, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows. As I stepped into the trees, the darkness seemed to close in around me, the sounds of the night growing louder, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, my own frantic breathing. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow. "Over here," the voice replied, weaker now, as if whoever it belonged to was losing strength. I pushed forward, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the forest floor. Finally, I saw her, a young woman lying among the leaves, her clothes torn and bloodied, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I knelt beside her, my mind racing. "It's okay, I'm going to get you out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to you?" He's still out there," she choked out, her eyes darting around in fear. "He'll come back for me." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around, the shadows seeming to shift and move in the darkness. I had to get her to safety, but my car was too far to carry her easily. "Can you walk?" I asked, helping her to sit up. She winced in pain but nodded. With her arm over my shoulder, we slowly made our way back to the road. Every step felt like an eternity, the oppressive darkness pressing in on us. As we reached the edge of the forest, I felt a presence, a weight of eyes watching us. I turned my head, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. My car was just a few yards away now. I urged her forward, every sense on high alert. We were almost there when a loud snap echoed through the trees. I spun around, my flashlight beam landing on a figure emerging from the shadows. He was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but I could feel his gaze piercing through the darkness. My heart seized in my chest as he took a step towards us. "Run," I shouted, practically dragging the woman the remaining distance to the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and shoved her inside, slamming the door behind us. I started the engine, my eyes fixed on the man who was now standing at the edge of the forest, watching us with an eerie stillness. I floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as we sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. As the distance between us and the figure grew, I felt a glimmer of relief. The woman beside me was sobbing, her fear palpable. I reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're safe now," I said, my voice trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. But even as I drove towards the distant lights of civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the darkness of the forest had followed us, and that something far more sinister was lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. I was halfway through my drive from Dallas to Albuquerque, a trip I had made countless times before. But tonight felt different, oppressive. The inky black sky hung low, devoid of stars, as my headlights cut through the empty highway. I was alone, the road stretching endlessly before me, flanked by open plains that seemed to go on forever. I glanced at the clock, 2:37 a.m. I still had hours to go, and fatigue was starting to claw at my mind. The nearest gas station was a good 30 miles back, and there wouldn't be another one for at least 50 miles ahead. The isolation was suffocating, the darkness playing tricks on my eyes as I strained to stay awake. Just as I was considering pulling over to rest for a bit, I saw something up ahead, a flicker of movement at the edge of my headlights. A figure, standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. My heart skipped a beat. It was a young man, his clothes torn and dirty, his face pale and desperate. I slowed down, rolling down my window as I approached. "You okay?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. "Please, you have to help me," he said, his voice trembling. "My car broke down and I've been walking for hours. I need to get to the next town." I hesitated, every horror movie I'd ever seen flashing through my mind. But his eyes were filled with genuine fear, and I couldn't just leave him there. "All right, get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. He climbed in, his hands shaking. "Thank you," he breathed, his relief palpable. "I didn't think anyone would come by." "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Where are you headed?" "Just to the next town. I need to find a phone and call for a tow truck." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the car thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the road ahead. Suddenly he spoke again. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I glanced at him, caught off guard. "Not really." "Why do you ask?" He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "Because I've seen one, tonight." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his eyes haunted. "My car broke down about 10 miles back. I was trying to fix it when I saw her, a woman, standing by the side of the road. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, like something out of the 1800s. She just stood there, staring at me. I felt a knot form in my stomach. And then what? She started walking towards me, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just kept coming, her eyes locked on mine. I got this overwhelming feeling of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. I ran, and I didn't look back. I didn't know what to say. His fear was contagious, and I found myself glancing nervously at the dark road ahead. It was probably just your imagination, I offered weakly. You've had a rough night. Maybe, he murmured, but he didn't sound convinced. We drove on, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears. The highway stretched out endlessly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift and move, and the darkness outside the car felt almost alive. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the distant glow of lights, finally, a sign of civilization. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly as we approached the small town. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the neon sign flickering in the night. "Thank you," the young man said, his voice trembling. "I'll go in and call for help." "Sure," I replied, still shaken. "Good luck." He opened the door and stepped out, pausing to look back at me. "Be careful on this road," he said. "There are things out there that shouldn't exist." With that, he walked towards the diner, disappearing into the warm light. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I decided to go inside and grab a coffee before continuing my journey. The diner was quiet, a few truckers and late-night travelers scattered at the tables. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, my eyes scanning the parking lot. The young man was nowhere to be seen. After a few minutes, the waitress brought my coffee, her expression curious. "You all right, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Just a long night. I gave a guy a ride here, young, dirty clothes, kind of frantic. Did you see where he went?" Her brow furrowed. "No one's come in here in the last hour except you." A cold wave of fear washed over me. "Are you sure?" He said he needed to use the phone. She shook her head. "I'm sure, sweetie. Maybe he walked somewhere else." I didn't know what to think. I finished my coffee quickly, paid the bill, and headed back to my car. The parking lot was empty, and the road ahead seemed darker than ever. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd encountered something beyond my understanding. The young man's story echoed in my mind, and I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing by the side of the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the unease never left me. When I finally reached Albuquerque, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I never found out what happened to the young man or if he ever found help. But every time I drive that stretch of highway at night, I can't help but feel a presence, a lingering dread that reminds me of that eerie encounter. And I always drive a little faster, hoping to leave whatever haunts that road far behind.